Well, ever since Sony launched their Spider-Man universe with all the Spider-Man villains but no Spider-Man, there have been many questions from us fans, and now it looks like we have a bit of a definitive answer from a Hollywood trade. Let's take a couple of minutes to talk about the real reasons why Sony never used Spider-Man in any of their Spider-Verse films, and how that could change moving forward. Well, it looks like the mysterious question has finally been answered. Ever since Sony kicked off their Spider-Man universe, without Spider-Man, fans have been wondering what's going on behind the scenes, and we really have never got any kind of definitive answer. Now that universe is wrapping up, the details are finally bubbling up to the surface, and us fans will get some answers on what was going on and why this was such a mess. But let's roll back the clock a few days first. Earlier this week, we found out that Kraven the Hunter would indeed mark the end of Sony's Spider-Man universe. But now we've got an update from Variety, and it seems to dispute the claims a little bit and give some context to what's going on. Now, according to the trade, there was never technically a shared universe for these characters. At least that's what Sony is claiming. Both Madam Web and Kraven the Hunter were built as standalone stories, and that happened only after Morbius, which was clearly in the same world as Venom, absolutely bombed. Now, after Sony acknowledged it intends to focus on more Spider-Man projects, it's pretty apparent these spin-offs have reached the end of the road and Sony is going to focus on something else. Now, some interesting stuff came out of that Variety report, and these quotes are, well, rather interesting. In the report it says, quote, "The looming box office failure of Kraven the Hunter almost certainly signifies the end of this endeavor at the studio, which one knowledgeable insider at Sony imputed to an industry-wide irrational exuberance about superheroes that has ultimately led to an overall diminishment of the genre's primacy as a leading force at the box office." Now, these same insiders, quote, fiercely defend the success of the Venom trilogy, and although the first one did pretty good, it was very clear there were diminishing returns. Now, in that same report, apparently the success of 2018's Venom, quote, presented Sony with the false impression that audiences would flock to see a movie about any Spider-Man character without Spider-Man in the film. Now, we always assumed this was because Sony was stopped from using Spider-Man because of their deal with Marvel Studios. But Variety has reported from one Sony source that that was not the case, and Sony was free to do that. The trade actually said, quote, "But there was a feeling within the studio that audiences would not accept Holland's Spidey suddenly popping up in a live-action film that wasn't part of the MCU, especially after Spider-Man No Way Home and the Marvel Studios projects Loki and Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness established definitive boundaries to the Marvel multiverse." Now, apparently those Marvel projects actually threw a monkey wrench into Sony's plans because Sony was actually forced to do some heavy reshooting to Morbius to explain how Michael Keaton could possibly show up in another universe. This was one of the most clunky post-credit scenes in the history of post-credit scenes, and now that does make a lot of sense on why it was so bad. Now, honestly, guys, I don't really know if fans would have accepted Tom Holland moving into that Sony universe while existing in the MCU, but I will say this, it really looks like to me that Marvel outmaneuvered them by establishing these boundaries in the Marvel multiverse. This, I think, caused Sony to make some creative decisions that simply didn't click with fans, and that's why these movies didn't work. What's really funny about Sony getting outmaneuvered here, too, is I think Sony did it to themselves. Remember back when Amy Pascal was sitting in an interview with Kevin Feige and they were promoting Spider-Man Homecoming, and she started talking about how their characters were definitely in the same Marvel universe as the MCU characters. Now, Kevin Feige's facial expressions told the story there because that clearly wasn't something they had talked about. And honestly, I think that particular moment caused Feige to readjust some plans and establish those boundaries that eventually really hurt Sony's efforts to expand their own universe. Now, in that same report, they did make it clear that Sony is aware that these movies aren't working and is likely to be more, quote, discerning about future endeavors. One veteran producer from the studio told Variety, and I quote, "You can feel the citizens of a mile away. They're grinding out product and it feels like there's no quality control." Now, all of this sounds like it does make a lot of sense, but it also feels like that Variety's report is kind of putting the best face on this problem. And we did get an interesting update after this report dropped from the Cosmic Circus's Alex Perez. Now, Spider-Man News over on Twitter reported this about Tom Holland not appearing in the spin-offs because they thought the fans wouldn't accept it. And Perez's response was really telling. He actually said, quote, "I don't know who decided to report on this in the middle of the night, but this was not the main factor that pushed them not to put Tom in their films. This implies Sony cares about what we think. If they cared for what we wanted, the SSU would be very different. The main driving force behind why Spider-Man never showed up is because of the collaborative effort with Marvel and Kevin asking them not to because of the eventual possibility of their universes colliding later on. Will they ever collide now? Who knows? Now, honestly, guys, I love the Cosmic Circus, and I'm going to pretty much plant my flag with Perez here. Sony has given us the vibe for a really long time. They don't really care what fans think. And this whole series of movies is a prime example. The whole thing has been a cluttered mess, and clearly Sony never really had a plan. Now, I do think Perez's second tweet talking about the eventual possibility of universes colliding have been what Sony has counted on from day one. They have always hoped to be able to ride Marvel's coattails for their Marvel characters, and honestly, it completely failed. You have to stand on your own work, and Sony trying to do it this way basically left them as second fiddle to what Marvel was doing, and fans recognized it immediately. It was always very clear to me that Sony kind of intended on making it as muddy as possible on where their characters lived and if they were part of the MCU. This, I think, was because they hoped it would drive people into the theaters, and honestly, after watching Marvel do billion-dollar movie after billion-dollar movie, well, they wanted a piece of that pie, and they kind of tried this convoluted and very dishonest approach that didn't sell with fans, and once fans figured it out, the cynical response to it was absolutely devastating to their projects. Now, will these universes eventually collide? Well, actually, I think they will, and that'll happen in Secret Wars. We've already heard that multiple Marvel worlds, anywhere from 8 to 10, could eventually be mashed up in the Secret Wars project. So when this does happen, I think Sony really hopes that Marvel will take their Spider-Man world, mash it into the MCU, and then after the smoke clears, hopefully they have better standing for their projects. At this point, Sony's best bet, quite honestly, is to just let Marvel make their Spider-Man films. Make a deal with Marvel Studios, allowing them to take advantage of the laundry list of villains that Sony controls from their Spider-Man contract. Remember, Ryan Coogler wanted to use Kraven the Hunter in Black Panther, so these plans have been stymied for a really long time, and Sony would make a ton more money just by working directly with Marvel Studios. When you look at the profitability of these films and how much red ink exists, yeah, sure, the first Venom movie made money, and the next two eked out a profit, but the bombs that were Morbius, Madam Web, and the upcoming Kraven the Hunter pretty much wiped out all the profit. We know Sony is looking to typically make about 50 cents on every dollar of production. This came from that Sony hack several years ago, and at this point they're missing that mark by a mile, and when you combine all the universe together, well, Sony spent over $1 billion to basically make nothing. The future of Spider-Man is definitely bright, and Tom Holland's going to carry the torch for a while in the Marvel Universe. I'm really hoping Sony gets their act together, basically lets go of their own ego, and lets Marvel run with this ball. Just by allowing Marvel to run with any single character for one movie would generate more profit for Sony Studios than Kraven, Morbius, or Madam Web did combined. Well, technically, if it made $1, it would make more profit than all of those films, but you guys know what I mean. So, what do you guys think? Do you think Sony has a future working with these Marvel characters, or should they just give them up to Marvel Studios? And do you think Marvel outmaneuvered Sony from day one? Honestly, guys, I think they did. Now, before you take off, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button, ring that bell for all the updates, and make sure you get every notification because we do daily Marvel and DC content, and we don't want you to miss any news.